Welcome back, little helpers. We have a topic today that Kibby and I have not encountered yet personally, but we definitely want to know how to do this when the time comes. So to help us, we have a returning favorite guest of ours and yours, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez. He is the director of the Youth and Family Institute. He is an associate professor at Pitzer College. He's the founder and director of Global Mental Health Lab, and he is a trainer and consultant at Behavioral Tech, Bitech. Marcus, welcome. Today you will be helping us figure out what to do with those pesky teenagers who are behaving poorly.
Yes.
Hopefully. I know so little about this topic, but you have, I think, become like our resident parent expert. You were helping us learn how to validate our kids' emotions before. So can you tell us a little bit about the work you do on this topic with children, kind of what your background is?
Yeah. So I work with children. And I feel like I'm as I'm hearing you introduce me, I'm thinking like I have a preteen. I have preteens. And I wonder, like, in 20 years, if I listen back on this recording, we'll be like, ooh, Marcus, you thought you knew so much. So I guess like what I'll say is like what I'm speaking from is clinical experience, like theoretical and practical. And then also like it's also possible that my own process of parenting will humble me. So I want to remember that. So yes, I will speak to how to do this work. I guess I'll start with a little bit of just like, I didn't work with adolescents early in our grad program because we all went to the same program. I didn't do that mainly, I would say, because of how intimidating it was to work with parents. Mm-hmm. And helping kids who are struggling. Again, I don't have like data to support this, but anecdotally, it seems like most people who don't work with kids and adolescents, a really big reason is it's challenging to figure out how to support the parents, how to work with that family system. And so it's something that I dedicated myself to in the last couple of years to figure out like, how can we do that so that parents don't get in the way of the treatment, but they really support the work that we're trying to do with their kiddos.
Awesome. I just realized I do have a personal connection to this. I live with a teenager who is the teenage son of my boyfriend, but he's so well behaved that it didn't even occur to me for a second when I was introducing you. But on the other hand, I am looking for how to connect with him more, and I bet that that's pretty related. How to foster connection with your child or teenager. So I don't know, where do you want to start with this topic? Like, what do you think is the helpful kind of first thing to wrap our minds around?
Yeah. Ooh. I think I could go anywhere.
I can ask an opening question of what do people come to you and seeking parenting coaching or therapy for their kids often for? I mean, we were talking about kids and teens who act out, but what are the kinds of things that people come in saying, help us, Dr. Rodriguez, my kid is doing XYZ, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to help them. Like, what do you see in your work?
Yeah. I think everything across the spectrum. Like I'll go through in my mind like some of the clients I'm working with now. Like one of them, like the kid has various forms of dysregulation, and then they were driving, they got into a fight with their parents, and they jumped out of the car. Like the start of that one movie, I forget. Like they just jumped out. Like, or sometimes they'll engage in self-injurious behaviors, or I think another common one is kids using drugs. Like since the pandemic, kids being on their phone for like 15 hours a day is a problem. Or like school refusal. Parents will say like, my kid just won't go to school, which like prior to the pandemic, that wasn't really a thing. Like when I was a kid, I didn't wake up and be like, am I going to go to school today? You know, but now that's a genuine question that kids like ask. Some kids are like, will I go to school today? And then once they don't go for a while, it becomes, so there's like school refusal, there's fighting, and then there's also kids who have like really severe anxiety And so there's lots of places they don't want to go. The parents will plan a trip. This just happened. They'll plan this really big trip where they're super excited to go to Central America. They have all these different excursions planned. And then the morning of, the kid says, I'm not going. The parents are like, wait, we don't have caregiving for you. We are also too young for us to just leave you for 2 weeks in our home. And yeah, they ended up, like, last minute, they had to cancel the trip. It was really stressful. The kid felt guilty. The parents felt angry. So it could be like, it's a number of things, I guess. Usually by the time they're coming to us, it's because it's bad enough that it's really causing a lot of stress to the family system. Either because the parents are feeling really scared, they're feeling really frustrated, they see that it's causing, like, it's hurting the relationship, like, they're not doing well in school. So those are the kinds of situations where a family would bring their kid and say, hey, we need help.
That's a lot. It seems like a lot of non-participation. Like kids checking out either mentally with their phones or physically from school or trips. It's like kind of, it sounds a little bit more like a withdrawing.
Yeah, I think, like, I guess when they feel emotionally overwhelmed, yeah, they will do whatever it takes to reduce the emotional intensity of their feeling in that moment. So whatever the avoidance is, like making lots of rules about what they can and can't do, where they will and won't go, topics that will and won't be discussed at home or around them. Yeah, so there is definitely a lot of avoidance. Avoidance, I think, we typically associate with anxiety disorders, but avoidance also just, yeah, self-harm, right, as a way to avoid feeling overwhelming shame, for example. Like, I just had a kid who, an intake that I did not long ago, where they were discovered to be having sex in the shower with their partner, and the parents said that they were going to be gone for a long time. Their plans changed. They came back early, and then the parents discovered them doing this. The parents, like, yelled at the two kids. One of the kids left, and then they kept, like, lecturing their child. They went to bed, and then the kid ingested a lot of medicine to try to kill themselves, quickly got scared, came to the parents and said, hey, I just took all these meds, so they had to go to the hospital. But even that, like, that moment of taking the medication, it is still a form of avoidance. It's that they were feeling so much shame about what had happened, and it was, like, so overwhelmingly painful, they couldn't really think of another way to bring down the intensity of that shame. And so they were just grasping for anything. They were on their phone, they were talking to friends, they were spiraling in their head, and finally they're like, yeah, I think I should just, like, the only thing I can think of that would work at this point would be to kill myself.
The one thing you talked about last time you were a guest that has totally, I mean, it's such, like, a simple process, but it's, like, really changed how I do therapy, is the idea that typically these symptoms are just avoidance of the feeling of being helpless and out of control, and that there's a preference to feel or do almost anything that can get rid of that feeling. And that reminds me a lot of this. Kibby, I think what you just pointed out, though, is really interesting, because I was waiting for you to say something more along the lines of the example you just gave, which is like, oh yeah, these kids are doing drugs, they're getting in trouble, they're doing petty crime, they're, like, doing things out in the world that are problematic. And instead it was a lot of withdrawal. And I wonder if that's a shift we're seeing, because we certainly hear about it with boys withdrawing from socializing. But the examples you initially gave were, like, refusing to go on trips, refusing to go on schools, getting stuck in phones, just a lot of isolation. And I wonder if you've seen any trends with that.
Yeah, even, like, so I'm consulting with some school districts here in California, and it's really interesting in talking to the principals, some of them who have been principals for, 20 years. They said they see a big shift even in, like, fights. Again, this is anecdotal, I don't have data, but these are what these principals here in LA are saying is, before, when they first started working in the 90s, there would be lots of boys fighting. They said now, like, it's way less common. They said actually, like, the school fights that occur is mostly among the female students. They said, and it'll sometimes, they said the most common trigger is someone will post something on social media and someone else will somehow mock that, right? That post somehow will do something that leads to the other person feeling shame. And that is, the avoidance of that shame, the avoidance of the sadness, like we had talked about last time, is there's such an intense desire to avoid these really unpleasant emotions that they feel mostly totally out of control to manage, that they just decide, all right, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll walk out of class. Another thing that principals at these middle schools, they said kids just get up and walk out in the middle of class. They don't say anything. They don't ask anything. It's just anything to get rid of the feelings that they're having.
It's wild. What kind of drugs are the kids doing these days? Like what? I mean,
like all of the drugs.
Because I thought that there's some data that kids, as adolescents, are doing, as Jacqueline's saying, doing a lot less. Like they're driving less, or having less sex, and doing fewer drugs. But you're seeing, is there like a shift in drug behavior recently, or?
I think now with vapes, it's way easier to smoke weed at school. Like it looks like someone's just pull out this like you don't have to roll anything. There's no fire involved. There's no like smoke. It's just like a quick boom, and then they can use weed in the middle of school. They just step into the bathroom. They don't even have to. They just like lean down underneath their desk and they can take a hit in a way that like just like 15 years ago they would be almost impossible to smoke weed during class, right? Like and now with vapes that's more possible. And then parents don't even know. Like they'll be like, oh, is this marijuana? Is this a cigarette? They just see a little thing, and now some of these vapes don't even look like a vape. They just look like a little toy almost. And so some parents who aren't super savvy are like, oh,
do you see more
is that a fidget toy?
Societal culprits or parenting style culprits? So, for instance, boys having fewer friends seems like that's a societal culprit. Social media taking over like how kids socialize and whether they socialize in person, lockers being taken out of schools because of fears of like school shootings. That's something that's happened at my stepson's school. But I've also heard a lot about helicopter parenting being a big problem and parents feeling terrified to give their kids any kind of independence. So I don't know, what do you think of those kind of various factors?
I focused much more in my clinical work leads me to focus on parental factors, not because I actually think that explains, more of the pie of like why this kid is struggling, but because I feel like I have a little bit more control or agency as a therapist working with a family to influence the family factors, as opposed to like, I'm not in policy, like I'm not a politician. Like, so I don't even know how to answer that question. I would say, certainly what I focus on is the ways that families are involved and the things that they're doing right now that aren't working and the things that they can do that work better. And sometimes even thinking about that question is a way that parents avoid doing the work that they can do, right? Like if a parent I'm thinking like if a parent asked me that question during like a session, my answer would be like, I would probably give something to answer like this. And I'd say, and I wonder if it's easier for us to talk and think about big societal issues than to talk about like individual interactions that you're having with your kid and what might be getting in the way of you maximizing the potential of those interactions for their wellness. So yeah, I'm not an expert in like I don't know, like I don't know the big societal factors, but my gut tells me that yes, the solution is, if we're seeing big emotion dysregulation, then yes, like I think that a lot of these kids are living in an invalidating, like we need to fix the environment, right? And I don't just mean like the family. I mean like there are many things that aren't working about about our society now for kids, and yet I don't know how to intervene on that. And so then I end up feeling helpless, similar to parents. So yeah, I guess my answer would be like both. And I have tools to help families and parents, as opposed to like I don't have a tool to be like, oh, like here's a letter, copy paste this and send it to your congressperson. I don't know.
Well, what are you seeing parents doing that is not working, right? Like I'm just, as you were saying about the vape things, I was like, oh my God, what would I do if I caught Jackson in a couple years with a weird toy that actually is a drug apparatus, or just finding him having sex in my shower? Like, I don't, like I can imagine just, just reacting out of like mama bear instincts. But what are people doing that you think is like not helping the situation?
I'll tell you the number one thing, and it's not the only thing, but it's the most common one, is that parents try to change their kids' minds in order to change their behavior. That is the most common, right? I mean, that's even what we do as therapists. Like when we first start doing therapy without any training, if they're like, here, get into the room with this patient and like try to help them with their depression, anxiety, our go-to is tell me what you're thinking and let me try to change how you think. And when I change how you think, it's going to change how you feel. And when I change how you feel, it's going to change your behavioral urges and what you do, and then you'll feel better.
Makes sense to me.
Like that is just our go-to. Like if you go to Starbucks and you start like meet a total random stranger and you like start venting about like, oh, like what's going on? What are they going to do? They're going to try to change, to help you. They're going to try to change your mind in order to change your behavior with super good intentions. That is really problematic when it comes to all the list of behaviors that we were just now describing, right? Like, so my number one thing that I tell parents not to do, by the time they've come to me, they have exhausted the strategy of let me change my kid's mind in order to change their behavior. Because what that does is it hurts the relationship. Because so I don't know, they'll try to convince their kids to not smoke weed. They'll tell them why it's bad. They'll present them with data, or they'll try to explain to them like why it's so important that you go on vacations and get exposed to the world, or like why going to school. Like they will provide them with lectures and criticism and all sorts of strategies that ultimately are intended to change what the kid thinks and therefore how they feel and what they do. But in that process, what ends up happening as the kid gets older and they become like a tween and a teenager is that then it starts to lead to debates. Like the efforts to change their kid's mind leads to a debate, and debates lead to fights, right? Can at least, or arguments, and arguments can lead to fights, and fights, when it goes really poorly, either the fight starts to feel out of control for the parent, or if the parent feels like they kind of lost the argument, they have more authority, they have more power in the relationship. So they can just say like, okay, fine, well, I'm taking away your phone, or like, fine, like you can't use the car, or whatever limit. They ultimately, like, I'm not giving you any money, so it doesn't matter, you're not going to that concert, right? Like they ultimately do have more power. So like they'll first try to change their kid's mind, and when it doesn't work, they still have the power to say, anyway, it's going to be the way I want it to be regardless. And that's when the kid feels like, now I'm powerless. So then they'll act out in some way that feels really scary. That's when a parent comes to therapy in our first session, like, and I have the family for the intake, and it's like the parents and the caregiver and the kid. They'll usually start with a story, like, oh, my kid just like threw a chair through the window. They actually kicked the dog so hard that like it broke ribs, and we had to take it to the right. So they'll start with that story. What they don't tell you is the context. Almost always it was some version of, I was trying to change my kid's mind. It became a debate. It became an argument. It became a fight, until eventually, because I have more power, they use the power they do have, which is I threaten to commit suicide. I threaten to self-harm. And once I do that, or I actually engage in the behavior, and then the parent's like, whoa, fine. If you're going to act so crazy, fine. Like, we'll do what you want. And so it just reinforces this dynamic that I described of like causing rifts in the parent. But the other problem that does is it reinforces it. Each time you're having that type of debate, the kid is looking for more reasons to support their current view. It's like they're digging deeper and deeper trenches. They're like, they're looking for evidence to support why they feel the way they do about, say, smoking weed and, or not going to class. And that's what debates do. They just cause you to look for more and more reasons to support your view, and therefore you get more and more entrenched in that view. You get more and more polarized in that view. Each time, this happens in therapy too, right? Like our patients will come and say, like, life is meaningless. If we take the bait and we start trying to describe why life is meaningful, what we're doing is we're helping them practice the process of explaining why life is meaningless. And so we're like, life is so meaningful, and we're pulling the rope on this side, and like, life is meaningless, and they're giving all the evidence. It's like, even just that process of trying to convince our patient or parent, convincing, their child or a loved one, convincing someone that they care about that life is meaningful, we're essentially like taking them to the gym to be like, here, like, practice the thought of life is meaningless. And so it's so hard, because when I tell parents you have to stop trying to change your kid's mind to change their behavior, they feel like, well, then what am I going to do? Right? Like, you're basically saying, like, give up on trying to help my kid, right? But that's like, for like what not to do, that's where I start.
Well, that's so interesting too. I'm just saying, like, I could see why that would feel like good parenting, because then it's like, oh, if I treat him like an equal, right? Like back, like to say I'm treating him like an equal. I'm going to explain my side and teach them and hopefully let them make their own decisions, versus like the old traditional version of, well, you're just not gonna, like, nope, no means no, right? It's like, I could see why that could feel like the right thing to do. But interesting about that. Sorry, Jacqueline, cut you off. What would you want to ask?
No, I mean, I that's been one of the hardest things to change in doing therapy too, is trying to intervene immediately when I'm taking bait and starting to argue a point, and then having to, and I still don't know that I'm doing it particularly well, but what do you do instead? I'm dying to know the answer.
Well, that's the problem, right? So, like, what do I do in my life? I don't, I mean, right now my kid is like so, like, she's just like so perfect that like I haven't felt the pull. But I think you can see how, like, if a parent comes home and realizes that, like, oh my gosh, my kid is sending compulsive texts to their ex being like, call me, why don't you pick up the phone? Are you there? Hello? And the parent somehow sees these messages. They feel like if I don't tell my kid why this is bad, that, like, I'm not being a loving parent. Like, if I don't tell them that this is ineffective, that continuing to reach out to your ex in a way that feels really desperate is a bad idea, then who is, and what, like that. So I think I do want to, like, acknowledge that, like, parents have, like, I don't know, this urge to do this because it feels like if they don't, what else can they do? It feels like a loving and caring thing to do.
I think the other thing too is, like, I have much older siblings, and when they would try to convince me of something, I would be much more receptive to it, because I'm like, oh, you're cool role models, versus parents. It's just a very different dynamic. So I see that sometimes with my boyfriend's son, where I want to take, like, the cool older, cousin or sister or whatever, and he just doesn't.
Yeah. I think the reason that we do this also is because it works. Like, when it works so well, right? Like, cognitive therapy is popular because I tried to convince my mother-in-law to use my mother-in-law lives with us like half of the year, but she doesn't use a dishwasher. Like, she just won't. She just thinks, like, that's crazy that you would put a dirty dish into this box and it's just not going to clean your dishes. So I tried to explain, it didn't. And then I did some cognitive therapy. I pulled up a video of someone who put a GoPro inside of a dishwasher with nasty dishes that had been sitting in the sink for like 2 days. And I had to sit down with her. I was like, hey, let's watch this video, right? And guess what? After that, it worked. Again, like, the main problem was I couldn't convince her to just leave the dishes and I will do them when I come home, right? She feels like, no, a dish, the moment a dish hits the sink, like, boom. So like she can't tolerate that to wait for me to come do it at home. So I'm like, all right, if you can't do that, then at least use the dishwasher. Cognitive therapy worked. Boom. She saw that video. From then on, she'll put, like, anything in the dishwasher. It works. Like, when we can change people's minds about something, it's powerful and it's quick. So I still think that that's still plan A, right? Like, that's still option A. Try that. What I mean is when parents overdo it, they have already given their rationale for whatever behavior, like why it's important for their kid to have some sort of an extracurricular, and they have now given that lecture to their kid in 20 different ways. They've gotten their parents involved in giving them a lecture. They got their close friends to come over and they gave them a heads up, like, hey, my kid doesn't want to do any extracurriculars. Can you find a time, dinner, and we're just gonna, like, highlight the importance and the value given their goals. Like, that's what I'm saying doesn't work, is the overdoing of it, of not pivoting soon enough when they realize that this strategy doesn't work.
I'm guessing you then go into some version of, like, validating their feelings, or
yeah, tell us what to do. Just give us the goods. What do we do? We jujitsu their minds.
Yes,
we show them YouTube videos of GoPros and.
Yes. I mean, okay, so what do we do instead? I think that there's two main options. One is, and it sounds ridiculous when I share this with parents, but one is acceptance. It really, like, it sounds so radical. Like, if a parent says, like, my kid is smoking weed every day, and I suggest, like, maybe one approach is acceptance. they'll just think like, this is crazy that you're saying this. Like, you don't care about my kid or take my situation seriously. With matters that are not life-threatening, then yes, like, acceptance is always on the table as an option. And I don't say that as like some sort of like mental jujitsu where I'm trying to trick them and like, whoa, I actually genuinely mean, what if we didn't try to change this? And acceptance means what? Acceptance means, what if we allowed this to not be a thing that we lecture them on anymore? We don't ascribe punishments anymore. We just allow that behavior and trust that natural consequences, or hope, not even trust, hope that natural consequences will one day shape the behavior in the way that we want. So one day they'll realize, oh shoot, I want to give up smoking weed because I have these goals of performing better in sports or of doing well or getting into a college, and I'm realizing that when I really try to focus on studying for that test, or that I'm struggling, and I tried lots of different strategies. Oh, maybe smoking this much weed is interfering with my ability to retain this information and to concentrate and stay motivated. Then they decide, because they're seeing their grades slip or because they didn't get into college, that they decide, oh shoot, like I do want to stop smoking, like because my partner just left me because they feel like I'm using too many drugs. Then the natural consequences would lead them to say, oh shoot, I want to change. That's really, really scary though for parents to say, I'm going to accept. And yet there's a lot of issues that need to be accepted that aren't. And that option isn't taken seriously enough by parents. And again, I say that and I'm like, I feel like I need to come back to this in 15 years and see how hard it's going to be for me to hear myself saying this when it's my own kids. And yet, like, rationally, we know that's true. Like, there's wisdom in, we can't take up every single battle with our kids and be like, oh, like, you have to read and you have to do, exercise or yoga every day, and you have to eat in this really balanced way, and you have to sleep in a particular way, and you can't use swear words, and and we have all these, and like you have to be involved in these social and political issues in the ways that I want you to, and we have all of these issues, and we don't let go of any of them. That is where things get problematic, right? So I think that's one strategy. And then the other strategy is much more complicated. And I can go into it. But I guess any questions about I don't know, thoughts about the acceptance? I want to jump
into the before you go into that. Hearing that strategy of acceptance, my initial reaction was no way, or like hoping that it would be a reverse psychology of, yeah, sure, smoke all the weed you want, haha. And then the thing is, as a parent though, it is our job to use our experience and wisdom to curb our kids from situations that we know is dangerous, and they might not understand how dangerous it is. For example, like if I caught my future 13-year-old son smoking weed every day, I know that, okay, if his grades slip and he affects his health this way, this might have like really long-term consequences on his ability to get into college. Like, I don't know, who knows, neural pathways, like there might be consequences that I can't trust that he will discover and stop on his own, right? Especially if he's the kind of kid who is so dysregulated that bringing down intense emotion will take priority over all of those long-term, like, I need to get into college. Well, screw that. I'm really upset now and I need something to help me calm down, right? So I think like the acceptance part is tough to swallow because I don't really trust that the kids will do what you say and stop it on their own accord at the right time. Right?
It's true. This is where parents and kids get caught up in that cycle with each other, where like one case that I'm working with, there's the kid has trichotillomania, so they pull their hair and have now pulled all of their hair out, and used to have long hair past their shoulder, and now it's it's all like an inch long but slightly uneven, and the parent feels really, really anxious for this kid. It's affecting their friendships, it's affecting so many things, right? Then the kid will get anxious about something or upset about something and will reach out to the parent in a way that feels compulsive. We'll seek reassurance, we'll seek their help, we'll want their support right away. The parents are trying to have a very serious career, And so on the one hand, they know, like, I can't take this call right now. I'm in the middle of a really important meeting. On the other hand, when they get that request for help from their kid, they feel like I have to take it. Because if I don't, what if my kid then pulls their hair instead? And then they feel like, oh gosh, that feels so stressful for them. So they have their own anxious process now. Where like, I have to now respond to my kid. I have to like be there and do something that maybe goes outside of my limits of what I'm really able to do. But like, if I don't, then what is going to happen to my kid? And then that reinforces the kid to keep using this particular strategy to regulate their emotions, which is essentially, I'm really upset. All I do is I just tell my parent I'm really, really anxious. And now it's kind of your problem. Like now I watch my parents scramble to try to figure out ways to help me feel less anxious. And so I lose that sense of agency, like what we talked about last time, right? Like, because now like I just say, I'm super, super anxious and upset. And then I sit back and watch my parents scramble to try to make me feel better. I'm like, no, that didn't work. No, that doesn't work. No, that doesn't work. It's almost like this buffet, this like a sushi, conveyor belt of options that the parents are trying to bring to me to help reduce my stress and anxiety. And I get to just passively say, no, 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 which isn't good for the kid. But the parents feel like they have to keep bringing these efforts to reduce the kid's stress because then their own fear is, oh shoot, if I don't, right? And that's just one example, but that cycle is what happens, which makes it really, really hard to accept, to lean into the acceptance side of the solution.
Can you beef up rewards or punishments of the natural consequences? So for instance, with the weed example, you accept that they smoke weed every day, but you know that the only reason they would stop smoking weed is if they were motivated enough by possible rewards or consequences. And I know external motivation isn't the best, but like my parents used to pay me to get good grades.
Yeah.
So like if the kid, okay, we accept that you smoke weed every day, you do you, but by the way, if you get an A in science, you get $200.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the other option, right? Like the complex alternatives. So we've got like try to change your kid's mind to change their behavior. Don't do that. We've got like acceptance, and then we have this combination of strategies. Number one in this third bucket of like ways to approach the problem is setting limits, very, very specific limits, and communicating them very, very clearly and making sure that there's few. When I work with parents, I say you can only set 3 limits max. Because they'll be like, no, like my kid has a super messy room, and my kid is smoking, they're vaping, and my kid is swearing at us and their sibling, and my kid is not doing any of their homework, and my kid is self-harming. All of these behaviors are unacceptable, and I'm going to I've been using punishment for each of these. I would say we need to choose 3, and the only one that has to be on there from my perspective is the self-harm, right? And then you choose 2. Right? So we choose the life-threatening behavior where we say, all right, let's prioritize that, because we can't shape that many behaviors using punishment. Punishment extinguishes a behavior while the punisher is present, but it also like takes a big toll on the relationship. And so one option is we say, all right, we need to set up contingencies, and they need to be clear, and but the key is consistency. Parents want to use intensity to shape their kids' behavior. They want to be like, I'm going to just come down with such a strong lecture, use such strong and aversive words, they'll never forget it. Or I'm going to take the door off their room. I'm going to shut down their phone for a week. They'll come up with something really intense, hoping that like if it's intense enough, that's going to shape the behavior. What's needed isn't intensity, but consistency. Right, like the example that I give parents is when I moved to LA, I was living with my parents on the west side and driving to Claremont to teach at Pitzer. It's a super long drive. It's like 70 miles. And I would have to leave like at 6:15. And there's this portion on the 10 freeway where they have fast track, these 2 special lanes where you can, if you have a little like transponder on your dashboard, you pay like $3 and you get to go really fast. And one of the days I was like, oh shoot, I left too late and I was going to be late to class. And I was like, nope, screw it. I just pulled into the fast track lane and I went. I was like, yeah, like I have to, because I'm not going to like lose my job. But I knew 100% of the time I'm going to get a ticket when you go in fast track without the transponder. But I told myself like I'm going to sign up as soon as I'm done with teaching this class. A few weeks later, I forgot again, and I'm like, oh shoot! But I was like, yeah, I'm not going to lose my job for a $55 ticket. So boom, I pull into fast track. I did that 3 times, but I knew I was basically writing myself the ticket. If someone had taken a picture of me when I was going through Fast Track, they'd be like, this guy must be a billionaire. Like, he doesn't even care. Like, it doesn't matter to him. It'd be like dropping like a nickel. He's like, oh, it's too hard to even bend over for these $55. In reality, that was a ton of money, right? But they were so consistent, I didn't even have a big emotional reaction because I knew every single time. By comparison, the other example of non-consistent is the Civitan parking lot. So you remember, so we all worked at Duke Medical Center in psychiatry. There's this tiny little parking lot right outside of our building, and then there's this big parking lot around the corner. The big parking lot is monitored. You'll get a ticket if you park in this place you're not supposed to. The Civitan is this tiny little, probably has like 20 parking spots, and the parking enforcement folks would just never go over there. So when I was there, I would go and I would park in that little parking lot like all the time, like probably like 3 or 4 times a week, but they monitored it so seldom. I would get like a ticket maybe like once or twice a semester. And I'd come out and I'd be like, oh, I'd have this big emotional reaction. I'd be like, what? When I saw the ticket on my windshield, it was only a $25 ticket back then. And I'd be like, what's going on? The universe hates me, right? But I kept doing it for years because it was inconsistent. Mm-hmm. But if I knew that every single time I parked in the Civitan that I would get a ticket, then either I wouldn't have a big reaction when I did, or I would stop that behavior and I would leave my house earlier to make sure I could go to the parking lot that is for students, right? And so instead, over the course of years, I racked up way more parking tickets from the Civitan than I did from Fast Track because it wasn't consistent, which led to both like a bigger emotional reaction and a longer behavior. So when I tell parents, I was like, we've got to be super clear. And we phrase our consequences in terms of if then. If you blank behavior, then, X consequence. So that's step 1, is using consistency, not intensity. And even just that principle is so difficult for parents to accept because the issue feels so pressing. It's like, wait, my kid just cussed me out in the middle of the grocery store. Like that's not something that I can slowly shape towards. Like, I can't have that happen 3 times like Marcus and Fast Track. I need that to be the first and the last time it ever happens. And yet, like, consistency is really the path forward. The other approach is what you were saying, Jacqueline, is positive reinforcement. Is taking all of the other behaviors on their list and then coming up with what is an alternate incompatible behavior with that behavior I don't want that I can then reinforce. I can provide a reward for it. So it's like, all right, I want you to do well in school. I'm going to reinforce grades, right? I'm going to reinforce going to class. I'm going to like get strategic about, again, also if you blank, then this is the reward. And for parents, they feel like, wait, so I'm going to reward my kid for doing what they should do anyway? And number 1. Number 2, like, and this is maybe going to work over time by shaping, and we're only going to know once we start implementing these contingencies if it functions. They just feel like that feels like too long of a process, right? They want some quick solution to these behaviors. And the reality is it's going to be a combination of reinforcement, setting limits, and then once we have limits in place, then we can actually provide what our kid needs, which is validation. So if you come in the morning and you tell your kid like, hey, it's time to get up, you got to go to school, and the kid's like, I'm not going, but you've already set a contingency. Maybe the contingency is like, when you don't go to school, you don't have access to any of your devices for, during the time you're in school, and you lose, a privilege to use the car for 1 day that weekend. They can come up with something. And so great. So they set up that contingency and it's already been clearly communicated. Then the parent can just sit down and be like, oh man, what's going on? And the kid will be like, oh, I just feel so tired. Oh, okay. And they can get curious and ask like, oh, why are you tired? What's been happening? Oh, it sounds like you have a really big test today. You don't feel ready for it. Man, that makes sense. Like, it's so stressful to go when you're not ready. Or, oh, it sounds like things have been tough with your classmates. Like, man, like that sounds so hard. How can I help? Is there anything I can do? Or just to validate, like, yeah, that sounds really tricky and really tough, and I'm sorry that that's what's happening with your friend group, that it feels like it's imploding. The parents can just validate, and then after they're done validating, the kid's like, oh, so you get it, like you totally see why I'm not going to school. I'd be like, yeah, I get it. Be like, okay, so there's no consequence, I can have my devices, and they're like, oh, no, that consequence is still there. Right? Like that's the beauty of when you have clearly communicated, consistently implemented consequences for your musts. Then in that moment, you don't have to sit down and once again lecture them on why it's important to go to school. Instead, that morning you can get curious, you can validate, you can be supportive, which is what the kid needs. And of course, like parents also need to learn skills to regulate their own emotions so that when their kid says they're not going, they can like access their prefrontal cortex, they can get curious, they can provide that validation, which is going to then help their kid to be more regulated, to collaborate. The ultimate goal is, can we collaboratively problem solve on this issue, right? Which you're much more likely to get to when you're using validation and when there's just these consequences operating in the background.
Can you give some examples of ways to reinforce the behavior that you want? Because I have read that there's certain ways of rewarding that could actually backfire for kids, right? Like there's some people that say, you know, paying, giving money or grades or some other kind of like external, you know, reward would actually take the intrinsic, like, I want to do this, the intrinsic motivation, and actually just gear up that kid to just want to get the goodies, right? So is there like, have you seen some reinforcement or ways to encourage good behavior that's effective or that works?
I think it's helpful to think of rewards as like scaffolding, because you're right, it does need to at some point become more intrinsic. And so if the goal is scaffolding, and maybe you provide reinforcement initially until they see like, yeah, actually this does work for me. Like I do like going to bed earlier. I do. So for example, like I want my DBT clients to call me for skills coaching. They often don't. So I'll tell parents, I'll be like, what if you offer your kid $10 for the first 4 times they call me? And then it's my job to show them in those first 4 phone calls that I can be helpful. So, right. So like you reinforce to get them connected to the intrinsic value of that behavior. Not that you consistently say like by the end of, you know, of school, the reinforcement of getting paid for your grades, Jacqueline, I doubt was really the main driving force. It just became, it helped. It was just one more excuse when you're like sitting there and like, oh, I just want to lay here and watch like more Netflix. It would be one more thing that your mind could be like, but if you do this, like you're also going to get a little bit of money. It's not that it's sufficient to sustain the behavior, but it helps support effective behavior that, you know, that the kid in their wise mind does want to engage in.
That's really interesting.
I think that a bigger motivator though would be parental validation. I think getting validated by their parents is going to be the strongest source of motivation when they're like, oh, my parent gets it. Like my parent supports me, sees my challenges from my perspective. Yeah. But it's hard to have the margin to get curious and provide validation if you're still trying to change your kid's mind to change their behavior. Those two things are directly opposed. Like you can't do both.
Do you have situations where the kid just doesn't want to open up? I imagine like if the parent's trying to practice, you know, listening and validating, like what parent doesn't want to like talk to their kid about what's going on with them? But I imagine that like how do you even validate a kid who might be like, yeah, fine, nothing, and like shuts the parent out?
Yeah. Oh, I think it's tricky to try to figure out why they're doing that, right? Like sometimes they might be doing that because they've been burnt so bad so many times. They just feel like, ugh, I worry if I open up to my parent, I'm going to share more information than I want to, and then later that will somehow be used against me. Maybe I'm really vulnerable and I say, oh yeah, I was talking to Jacqueline and then we had this argument, and then you as my parent are like, oh, what happened? What did she say? What did you say? And then I'm being really vulnerable. You're validating me, but my worry is that fast forward 6 months, you and I have a big fight, and you'd be like, that's exactly why Jacqueline was so mad at you that day. Like, it's because you do this, not just to me, you do this to her, you do this to all your friends. And now I'm like, I wish I had never given you that information because you wouldn't be using it against me now. And again, that's getting really specific, but like the broad concern that kids have is like, I share this information And I just get burnt. I feel like it's later used as ammunition in trying to change my behavior, in trying to like perpetually trying to change me without a balance. Because you're right, it is our job. Like I'm constantly trying to change my daughter. I am. And trying to balance that with like, you know what, that's her. Like as opposed to each time I have the urge to engage in some change-based strategy, to also step back and be like, maybe I'm gonna let that go. Because if I watch her interact, we went to this trampoline park this last at the end of school year, and I had an entire day to watch her with her friends. I had things that I observed, like feedback I wanted to give her, like, Journey in that moment. And it's like, Marcus, let it go. Like, she's not asking for your advice. And she's doing just fine socially. Like, she doesn't need you to now coach her on how to get along with her friends. Just have a good time, Marcus. Just get on the trampoline and jump and stop trying to analyze ways to make her better. The best thing she can have is a good time with her dad at the trampoline park with her friends, right? Like, that's what she needs. Not her dad who's like jumping, but also being like, that was an interesting way for you to respond to that friend's request, Journey. Like, she doesn't need that, right? And so I think also sometimes parents have hurt their kids really like emotionally in ways that their kids just aren't ready to open up again. And so it takes time. And I think parents need to give their kids the time that it takes to show them that they're ready to approach things differently. That they can really validate them and try to understand them. And that takes time. Right? Especially when if you have like a kid who has consistently gotten, dysregulated because of something that happens with the parents, and then they have a big emotion, and in that big emotion, they respond in some way that is inaccurate or ineffective. And that's when the parent is like, oh my gosh, that's where they're like, look, why did you just yell that? Why are you kicking your sibling's seat in the car? Instead of recognizing like, yeah, like, let me validate the valid part. You're feeling upset that your sibling's sitting in the front seat again. You're worried that we're going to cut you out of the conversation, that you're not going to be, that you're going to take second class in our conversation, that you're not going to get to control the radio and have the music that like vibes with the mood that you're in. Like, because if we could provide that validation, it would reduce some of the emotional dysregulation. It would reduce the likelihood, therefore, of inaccurate expression and out of control behavior, which would then make it easier for the kid to express themselves accurately, which would make it easier for the parent to validate, which again is that cycle. Now the kid feels less emotionally aroused, less out of control, expressing themselves more accurately. The parents then don't get as dysregulated, so they can validate. And then, because the opposite is, it goes in the opposite direction. Dysregulation, inaccurate expression, the parents get upset, they invalidate, which leads to the kid feeling more upset, which leads to more dysregulation, which leads to more ineffective behavior, which makes the parents more upset, which leads to more invalidation. And then eventually, boom, the kid jumps out of the car. And they're like, whoa, my gosh, like, what's wrong with my kid? The opposite is that the cycle of like self-regulating, validating the kid using whatever skills they have to regulate themselves so they can express themselves more accurately. Because the reality is, it goes both ways. It's not just that the parents are failing to validate, it's that the kids are expressing themselves really inaccurately, right? Like the kid comes in, throws their backpack on the couch, hits the dog, like, and then they like go into their room, slam the door, like a frame falls off the wall. And the parents are like, what's going on? They're like, I hate this school, I'm never going back. It's really hard for a parent to validate that moment. All they want to say is like, we don't hit our dogs, right? Like, we don't slam doors in this house, we don't swear, like and yes, you're going back to school. Like, that kid just set themselves up for like 4 forms of invalidation. But like, what if they had come in and expressed themselves accurately instead? Like the parents like, hey, how was your day? Like, like super hard, I feel really discouraged, I had a big argument with my girlfriend or my boyfriend, and I just failed a test that I thought I was going to do really well on, or I just feel like I'm not as smart as my friends and I'm not going to be able to accomplish as much as that. Like, if they come in and express that, it's so much easier for a parent to be like, oh shoot, like, and they can validate, like, right? But if instead they lean into their secondary emotion, it's really hard for parents, because what's the valid? Like, they don't see anything valid. All they see is like dogs getting hit with backpacks, frames falling off walls, swear words being yelled. And so I think it's it's that, yes, the kid needs to be doing their work in therapy, and the parents need to be learning how do I regulate my emotions so that I can find the valid piece in what my kid is experiencing, so that I can reflect that to them.
Can you give an example of a case that you've seen or a parent who's had to learn that? I'm curious, like when I'm hearing that process of like learning how to validate instead, like how do you start? Like how
Yeah.
does that what does that look like? Like what give us some hope of some
Yeah.
parents who have
Okay.
figured it out.
Yeah. So here's one example. Again, this is not, I'm not, this is not like the most perfect case, but this is one that I'm currently working on. Is the parents have been saying for a really long time, I want my kid to stop smoking weed. And then when we come up with very clear behavioral consequences, right, and reinforcements, the parents can't stick to them, because as soon as they implement the consequence, the kid has a big emotional reaction. The parents get scared, and then they just fold like a cheap tent, and they're like, fine, fine, and they just let the kid do what they need to do, and they like, so the kid gets to do. So we go through that again and again, and finally I tell the parents, I'm like, what if we just lean into acceptance? With some, maybe you just say, you can't smoke in the house. There's a consequence for smoking in the home, right? You can't buy or sell on our front driveway. There's a consequence for doing that. Then what it's allowed the parents to do is to focus on, all right, instead of spending all their energy focusing on how do I get my kid to stop smoking weed, we instead shifted to, what is my kid's strengths? Because they're not the traditional strengths that these parents had to have, their traditional successful careers. So instead, what are my kids' strengths, and how do I help them maximize those and lean into them, rather than focusing on the ways that they are not meeting up to just the normative standards of what is successful academically and professionally, and making that shift. And it's really hard, because parents will be like, no, and they'll have moments like, all right, I'm going to accept. I'm going to say like, no weed at home, no buying and selling like on our street, and then I'm just going to focus on figuring out like, what are their strengths? How can I get them connected to sports, to hobbies, to activities that are going to work for them, where they're going to feel mastery, and they're going to feel, they're going to have like mastery and a sense of control and agency and competence, and feel happy with what they can do. And then they'll be like, no, wait, but they can't smoke weed. And I'm like, whoa. And we just have to keep coming back to, remember, what are the pieces we decided to accept? What are the hard limits for you? And then actually use your energy to understand your kid. What are their interests? What are their strengths? And how can you leverage your resources as parents to maximize those strengths, rather than focusing on all the ways that they're not perfectly aligned with more standard, like metrics for success.
Yeah, that's cool. In the example of the kid who comes in screaming with the backpack and the dog and the frame, like how kind of step by step, how would you, if you were a parent, approach that situation? Because all you see is a secondary emotion.
Yeah. I mean, in reality, I'd probably get really upset. So maybe the first thing I need to do is I would probably go to my wife and be like, Julia, like, did you just see what she did? Right? I need validation, because I'm about to try to validate. So and then I'm hoping that she would be more level-headed than me and be like, oh yeah. And then I'm hoping she'd say something like, man, I wonder if she had a really hard day. Because like, that's not typically, she comes in and says like, daddy, and like hugs you. Like, I bet she's, and then I'm like, okay, yeah, you're probably right. And then she's like, you know what, maybe she'd say something like, let's just give her some time. Let her cool off. But like, remember that she's really struggling, that she probably had a really tough day, and she's doing her best to regulate, but what came out was secondary anger. I'm going to go comfort the dog and let the dog know that Journey still loves him, right? Like, and I'm going to probably, when I do come back to talk to her, I'm going to say, hey, Journey, you broke that frame. I need you to pay for a replacement, right? I'm not going to yell it. I'm not going to like try to convince her why that's important. I'm going to state it as a fact. It's not like up for debate. I think a lot of times parents debate too much. When I explain to them the idea of like setting limits, what they think is, oh, I'm going to come up with these with this MOU essentially, and then you're going to, you're going to review a draft of the MOU and decide like, are you on board with this new arrangement? No, the kid's not going to be on board with the new arrangement, right? Like, they like the system as it is now. So it's not that. It's just saying, like, hey, here's what it is. And as quickly as possible coming to validation. Now that I've said you're going to pay for the frame, I'm going to trust that each time she breaks the frame like that or does something destructive that she knows it's going to cost her. It's just like the fast track, taking a photo of your license. 100% of the time there's going to be a consequence. I don't have to harp on that. Instead, I can sit down and be like, oh, Journey, is everything okay? Do you want to get frozen yogurt? Like, do we want to figure out, like, what's going on? It seems like you're really struggling. I'm here if you want to talk about it. We could go for a walk with Josh, since he did get hit by a backpack today, right? Like, and I think that maybe that's how I would approach it. Is to not. I guess maybe that would be modeling, like, in that example, in this hypothetical example, because again, like, let's fast forward 15 years. I have no idea what my life is going to be like. But assuming, like, I can stay in this wise mind and my daughter continues to be this easy, then I would hope that, like, that's what I would do. That I would practice some acceptance and then decide what are my limits, use reinforcement for that. And then otherwise, I'm giving her the opportunity to make a repair with the dog and take the dog for a walk, because the dog loves nothing more than walking. Like, the dog loves walking, next being pet, and third food. So, like, all right, like, I know you love this dog. I know you would have never done that on purpose. I wonder if he deserves a third walk today. I'll go with you if you want, right? So it's trying to foster connection. I think these kids need connection from their parents. Back to your question of, like, what is it, societal or family? I think it's both, but the piece that we have more control of is, like, can we leverage even the tiny little slice of pizza, that represents how much we are impacting our kids' outcomes, and just try to maximize that slice by maintaining a solid relationship where they feel understood and validated, where there's few consequences, but they're clear and they're consistent. And then we help them, like, I don't know, like, lean into their strengths while accepting things that, like, we wish were different and better.
So it sounds like, okay, so regulate self, then set contingency or remind of contingency, then go in and validate, offer yourself, and then offer solutions for repair.
If they want, like, to do collaborative problem solving, then great. Like, probably something is really bothering them. No one loves them as much as their parent, right? Like, so it's like, well, try to, like, get support from this person who wants you to be happy so much, like, just really wants you to find happiness. You can, like, two minds are better than one. So if you tell me the problem that got you so upset, so sad, so, like, embarrassed that you respond, like, that you came into the house that way, then maybe the two of us together could come up with a solution. Not me lecturing the solution at you, but, like, us exploring collaboratively. Like, that's the goal. And it's not that we have to do that every time, but, like, if we can do that more than we don't do that, that's the goal.
What about the opposite scenario? So with, like, in my situation, really, really good kid, but entered the teenage years and is really non-communicative now, like, says I don't know to everything. So that's not necessarily a behavior to modify, but there's a little bit of a concern that, like, will we know when something's bothering him, when he's struggling with something? And then just, like, wanting to foster communication, wanting to know him better. But I mean, I remember as a teenager too being like, I'm going to pretend that I'm asexual, so you don't even ask me about who I'm dating or who I like. Like, I'm going to really, shut things down a lot. So what might you do for that kind of kid? Or do you just accept? I'll get to know you in a few years.
I think that's a part of it, is giving the kid agency to decide how close they want to be. Right? Like, it comes back to the agency. Is like, at some point we can still express that I really, really want that. And we can demand, like, I do want, like, friendly, cordial. Like, that's the bottom line. If you walk in the front door and I say, hey, Journey, and you just look at me and walk away, like, okay, no, like, I do need you to say, hey, Dad, or, like, hello, or, like, so you decide what your bottom line is. Yeah. So I'm not, when I say, like, acceptance, that doesn't mean that there's no limits. So you come up with that, and then you just say, like, all right, you also do have agency, though, to decide. I remember when, like, I don't want to tell bad stories about my parents, so I won't tell that story. But like, I feel like in some ways I didn't have a lot of autonomy for how close I would be emotionally to my parents when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And I felt super trapped sometimes. So I think that, like, it's both. It's foster the environment where they want to be close to you and they know that if they need to, boom, you're there, ready. And also maybe not in every moment do they want that, and let them have some of that freedom while knowing, like, when you do turn to me, I'm going to be ready. I'm going to provide, like, I've shown you enough that, like, I'm ready to provide validation. I've also shown you that, like, I can be validating and still hold very clear limits, right? Like, that, like, being validating doesn't mean that I don't hold limits. So you don't have to talk to me, but you definitely can't, you know, whatever, break your siblings' stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so yeah, I guess, like, it's even think about it not with a kid, just like a friend. If you really want to be close to a friend and they seem to be getting quiet and distant around you, then I guess what's the best you can do? It's kind of the same, right? It's like, be validating, like, let them know, like, extend that offer of connection, like keep making bids for connection. And then what I tell parents is, I say, be very sensitive to any bid for connection that your kid makes. And they're going to be subtle. I think we're waiting for, like, this very mature, like, hello, Dad, would you be willing to talk to me about my friends and my plans for the future? Like, the bids for connection are going to be way more subtle. It'll be something like, ugh, today I found out that there's this new TikTok trend. Like, that's a bid for connection. Take it. And I tell parents, like, yeah, what is it? Show me. Yeah, like, what? Like, whenever there's or they'll be like, hey, Dad, can you come and look at this? Can you come and help me with this? Any bid for connection, I tell parents, accept it. Make sure that you can accept it 85% of the time. I remember Zach, our mentor, what he said. He was like, when he had teenage boys, when I was in grad school, he was like, I realize now I just have to show up whenever they're ready for me. He said, maybe it'll be like 12:30 in the morning. I just got back from, like, a hockey game. I had a long day with back-to-back meetings. And then suddenly I walk into my son's room to say goodnight, and then he'll say something. And he'll be like, I got to take it. He's like, I'm exhausted. I have a 6 a.m. meeting. But he's like, when it comes, you've just got to take it. Like, you have to decide, is that important to you? And with a teenage kid, when they make a bid for connection, just have your antenna out looking for anything that could be interpreted as a bid for connection. And when it comes, you've got to take 85% of those. That's an arbitrary number, but, like, I just mean to say a lot. You have to take, like,
majority.
Almost all of them. Yeah.
I love that.
Kibby, any further questions?
No, this has been great. I love like hearing what parents would naturally do. Like, I could so see myself doing all the things that you talk about parents shouldn't do, right? Like, trying to convince. I mean, I do it with my 2-year-old. He just started making a sentence, you know? So I love that. I love that balance too, because when you think of, okay, I should be a validating parent, that sometimes could feel like, well, then I have to accept that they're going to do drugs and be on their phone and, you know, like, and be nice and then listen to their feelings and, like, just be super permissive. But I like the distinction of being emotionally validating while setting pretty clear and firm and consistent contingencies around, well, if you do this, then we're going to do this. Setting those limits. So, I just loved it.
Yeah, this is really important work. I hope that at some point, Kibby, you'll get to talk to people about what your idea, your plan, because there's such a need. I think there's such a need for parents getting support. And like I said at the very beginning, a lot of clinicians don't want to do that work. It's hard work. And if you don't have good tools and you're not well equipped to support families, then you end up doing to parents the exact same thing you're telling parents not to do to kids. And I'll catch myself. I'll be meeting with parents and I'm trying to change their mind in order to change their behavior. I'm like, wait. I said, I cannot be doing the thing to you that I'm telling you not to do to your kid. I'm like, well, we got to stop. I was like, I've told you what I think is going to be helpful. And so now my contingency is, until you implement one of these strategies, we're not going to meet again. So you call me once you've implemented one of these strategies consistently for at least 1 week, and then we'll meet again, right? Rather than me trying to persuade you. And so, yeah, I just think like there are, yeah, for the kids who are really struggling, it's hard, to find those resources. There's very few therapists who work with parents like that, right? There's very few who do that work. It can feel sometimes scary. It's especially hard when you yourself are like in your 20s and you're talking to like, parents who are twice your age about their teenager that you're only like 7 years older than. They're going to be like, who are you? Like, don't. So I think having something like what you're creating, Kibby, I think is going to like meet such a massive need that I see in schools. I see it in clinics. I see it in hospitals, that like parents are underserved. And the reality is parents have so much fear themselves. The reason they're overreacting is because it's almost like, for many of them, it's trauma. Like the most traumatic thing that some of these parents have seen was like coming home to their kid like passed out from medicine, or coming in to see like that is so scary. And so the parents have their own fear. The parents have a lot of shame too, of people judging them. When you take your kid to a hospital, a lot of people they'll judge you, which is so unfortunate. It is not parents' fault. Back to your first question, Jacqueline, is it the environment, is the parents? It's not. And yet a lot of times society will be like, ooh, what did you do to end up with a kid who's XYZ behavior? It's like, like I have 4 kids. I raised them all the same and they came out really different, right? Like, and there's also a lot of stigma where like if you live in a building and you and your kid are yelling, or your kid will sometimes get really dysregulated, all of the neighbors can hear it and they'll just be like, whoa, like let's not talk to that neighbor, and like don't let my kids go play at their place. There's that stigma. There's also like parents, it's also tough because they've typically, by the time that they recognize that they need help too, they've probably had a lot of treatment failure. They themselves lack the skills to manage these difficult situations. They're walking on eggshells because they're not totally sure what's setting their kids off, right? Like once you explain to them that like trying to change their kid's mind to change their behavior is a problem, they're like, oh, but they didn't know before. They're just like, in their mind, they just feel like sometimes my kid just explodes and they can't quite explain why, or that my kid will just like run out of the house and leave and they won't come back for 2 days. I don't even know where they are. They turn off their phone. I can't access them. I call their friends. I don't know where they're couch surfing. Are they sleeping on the street? Like, so the parents, then it is really hard because sometimes kids do things that doesn't make sense and they're not communicating. So parents have a lot of their own fear and then a lot of their grief, right? Like parents, when their kid are first born, they're not thinking like, oh, one day I'm going to take my kid to a residential program because of XYZ behavior, right? Like there's a lot of grief in what they expected and wanted for their relationship with their kid and their life with their kid. And there's just not a lot of people there to provide that support for everything from like the parents' trauma to their grief to the stigma in society to the different expectations. It's so hard for parents because school has a certain set of expectations and their own parents, right? The grandparents and society and religious community, and like there's just all this pressure that's put on parents. And so I think having resources, like coming up with solutions like what you are doing, Kibby, I think is going to meet such an important need.
Thank you. And if people are looking, to talk more to you or to look into what you provide or any other resources you want to share.
Yeah, I think if people are in California and they're looking for, if they think like, yeah, I think I could benefit from a few sessions. Because again, I don't require, when a kid comes to do therapy with me, we don't require them to like do parent coaching the entire 6 months that I'm doing DBT with their kid. But rather, DBT meaning dialectical behavior therapy, but rather to say, why don't you commit to meeting with me 4 sessions? And I'll explain to you these strategies, like how to understand your kid, why they ended up where they are and what you can do about it, how to validate, teach you like practical tools for validating, teaching you how to come up with like contingencies and how to hold those consistently and communicate them clearly, how to come up with like behavioral reinforcement plans. Like, let's do this. Let's meet for 4 times and then we'll figure out if you want to continue. And then at least you know that we have rapport. I understand you. I understand your kid. So even if we stop and everything's cool, and then like 2 or 3 months later, something happens with your kid and now they're in crisis, when you reach out to me, you're not reaching out to a stranger, or you're reaching out to someone who has context for your family. But what ends up happening instead is the parents don't talk to the therapist, then the kid's in crisis, and then they reach out, and this is a total stranger. They're who are you? You don't know me, I don't know you, but we're also in crisis, so there's no time to figure that out so that you can feel compassion for me instead. Yeah, and so that dynamic. So a lot of times it's just do 4 or 6 sessions. If you find it helpful, you can choose to continue, but at least you've got that in your pocket, and one day if you need to, you can come back to it.
Amazing. Well, little helpers, I'm going to set a contingency. You give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and we'll put out another episode. I know sometimes it can be hard to get around to it and think about what to say, but you could always repair if you haven't done a 5-star rating before, and give us one now. And stick with us for another episode. Thank you so much, Marcus. I'm sure you will be back again. We love having you here, and we'll see you all in a couple weeks. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval